Okay, so in chapter 13, we're going to be taking a look at one of the first sets of biomolecules, which are our carbohydrates. And here we're going to see some direct applications of what we learned in chapter 12 when we looked at the alcohols, aldehydes, ketones, and carboxylic acids, right? So carbohydrates are going to be our first sort of foray into the biological molecules. So as you probably know, just to give you a little bit of background of carbohydrates, they are the major source of energy that your body is going to use. And carbohydrates, we get those from our diet, right? So the things that we eat on a regular basis are really good sources for carbohydrates. The name carbohydrate actually sort of tells you what these are made up of, and they're made up of the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right? So you're going to see lots of C's, lots of H's, lots of O's in our carbohydrates. So let's just say lots of them. A couple other terms that we use that we're going to see being used for carbohydrates, they're sometimes also called saccharides, or just generally sugars, right? So sugar, carbohydrate, saccharide, they all mean the same thing. So where do we get carbohydrates from? So a typical, probably the most common carbohydrate that we're going to see is something known as glucose, which has the formula C6H12O6. These are typically made by a process called photosynthesis. And this is a process whereby plants use sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water vapor to produce sugars, and the other product that they make is oxygen, right? So for example, in the process of photosynthesis, we can say that we have CO2 combining with H2O with the help of sunlight to make our sugar, like glucose. And then we also get oxygen as the other product in this photosynthetic process. All right, this is extremely important. And just to remind you, this is unbalanced. Right, it's an extremely important process because plants carry out this and they make sugars that we can eat and get energy from, or animals eat the sugars in plants and then we eat the animals and then we get energy from that. But the other thing here that's produced is the oxygen, right, that we are able to use. And what we do as humans or as animals, we actually do the opposite of this process, where we take and we eat those sugars like glucose and we breathe in that oxygen. And what that oxygen does is it allows us to break down the glucose. When we break it down, we end up breathing out carbon dioxide and water vapor, right, that comes out in our breath. And then what we also get, and the main reason why we would want to eat sugars and eat anything, is to get energy, right? And this process is called respiration. So photosynthesis, what plants do, and respiration, what we do, are actually opposite processes. So photosynthesis is the process by which carbohydrates are made, sugars are made by green plants. We're going to see several different types of sugars or carbohydrates, and there are a couple of ways that we can classify them. The first is based on their size. So the first type of carbohydrate that we're going to see are the smallest, And these are known as monosaccharides. So mono here telling you that they're made up of a single sugar unit. And we'll take a look at some examples of monosaccharides in the next couple sections. We also have disaccharides. Right, and these are going to be made up of two sugar units bonded together, which means that if we have a disaccharide, we can break it down into two individual sugar units. And then we have the largest out of our sugars here, which are known or called our polysaccharides. And polysaccharides are made up of many. Lots of sugar units bonded together. Right, so we're thinking here polysaccharides are going to contain hundreds, thousands, even millions of these sugar units bonded together, and if we were to break them down, we would get lots of these individual sugar units from a polysaccharide. I will take a look, like I said, in the subsequent sections at these three and the important examples of these three types of sugars or carbohydrates based on size. So first of all, let's take a look at the monosaccharides. Monosaccharides, I'm going to jump down here really quick. Monosaccharides are sometimes referred to, and sugars generally are referred to as polyhydroxy aldehydes or ketones. So what does that mean? That means that these are made up of lots, so polyhydroxy, lots of OHs, and then either an aldehyde group or a ketone group is present. Right, and we saw all three of those functional groups in chapter 12. We saw hydroxyl groups, which identify something as an alcohol, and we also saw the aldehyde and the ketone. All right, so monosaccharides are going to be generally relatively small, made up of anywhere between 3 and 7 carbon atoms. And they're also going to contain a carbonyl. So remember, the carbonyl group looks like this. There's a C double bond O, and it's connected to 2 atoms on either side. And we saw in chapter 12 that there were 2 important carbonyl groups that were found in other functional groups, and these were the aldehydes. And if there is an aldehyde present in a sugar, we call it an aldose. So aldehyde again, C double bond O, that's the carbonyl, connected to a hydrogen on one side. And then our ketose, right, would be a sugar that contains a ketone functional group, which would have that carbonyl between 2 carbons on either side of it. Right, so aldehyde here, or sugar that contains an aldehyde, it's an aldose, right? So the first part of the name tells you it has an aldehyde functional group. A ketose contains a ketone functional group, and then the ending of both of these are O's, right? When you see that ending OSE, right, that means that that molecule is a sugar, right? So you can tell a lot from the name of something. So as a couple examples, here we have erythrose, which is an aldose, right? So it's a sugar that has an aldehyde group. There's a C double bond OH. And there's erythrulose, which is a ketose, and there's your ketone functional group right here, right? So a carbonyl between two carbons makes it a ketone. So we can identify our monosaccharides as having aldehyde, aldose, or ketone functional group, ketose. We can also classify them based on the number of carbons present. So for example, if there are 3 carbons, we call it a triose. If there are 4 carbons, we call it a tetrose. If there are 5 carbons, we call it a pentose. And if there are 6 carbons, we call it a hexose, right? So you saw these prefixes before, right? Tri, tetra, pent, and hexa before. And now we're just sticking those in front of the OSE ending that tells us that these are sugars. So we can combine the name of both the functional group and the number of carbons to give a much better description of the sugar. So for example, if we say that glucose is an aldohexose, okay, so what this is going to tell us is that it contains an aldehyde group and the ending here, hex, tells us that there are 6 carbons present in glucose, and then the OSE tells us that this is a sugar, right? So again, all parts of the name here are going to be indicative of the structure of our sugar in this case. All right, so here are some examples of some different types of monosaccharides. I mentioned, glucose being an example of an aldohexose. Here on the right side, we have another very common sugar called fructose, and fructose is a ketohexose, right? So keto meaning there's a ketone functional group, which is right here, your carbonyl between 2 other carbons. Hexose meaning there are 6 carbons, and if we count from the top, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the OSE ending tells us that this is a sugar. Okay, so let's do a quick example, and you'll see when we start looking at these structures that the way that we represent these structures of sugars are going to look slightly different than our regular depiction of organic molecules, because there are special rules that we use for sugars that make it a little bit easier to interpret those structures. All right, so here let's take a look at A right now. And let's first of all, so these are all sugars, right? So they're all going to have that OSE ending. Let's first of all decide how many carbons are in each of these. And let's see, in A we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this would be a hexose. And then let's see the functional group. So there's our carbonyl right here at the top. Is it an aldehyde or is it a ketone? Well, the carbonyl, the C double bond O, is attached to an H. So right away we know that that makes it an aldehyde. Right, and you always have aldehydes at the end of molecules. So this then would be an aldohexose.